On a scorching August morning in 1998, in a small town nestled in the high desert of New Mexico, a young woman named Rebecca Martinez left her modest adobe home to run errands at the local grocery store. She was 24 years old, a mother of 2 small children, and worked part-time at the county library. Her husband, Daniel Martinez, a mechanic at the town's only auto repair shop, told neighbors he last saw her climbing into their sun-faded blue Ford pickup around 9:30 that morning. By nightfall, Rebecca had not returned. Her truck was found 3 days later, abandoned on a desolate stretch of Highway 30 miles outside of town, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat, but no sign of Rebecca herself. For 26 years, her family would search for answers in a landscape of silence and suspicion. What happened to Rebecca Martinez on that sweltering summer day? And why would it take more than 2 decades for the truth to finally surface? The town of Esperanza sits in the high desert plateau of central New Mexico, a place where the earth stretches endlessly in shades of rust and gold, where juniper trees cling stubbornly to rocky hillsides, and where the sun beats down with an intensity that seems to bleach the very color from the world. In 1998, Esperanza was home to just under 3,000 souls, most of them families who had lived in the area for generations, their roots running as deep as the ancient cottonwoods that lined the seasonal creek bed cutting through the center of town. The main street consisted of a handful of businesses: a grocery store, a hardware shop, 2 gas stations, a diner called Rosa's where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the auto repair garage where Daniel Martinez worked alongside his father and uncle. The Martinez family lived on Cal de los Sueños, a street of small homes on the eastern edge of town where the pavement gave way to dirt roads and the desert began its long march toward distant mesas. Rebecca and Daniel had been married for 6 years. They had met in high school, where Rebecca had been quiet and studious, a girl who loved books and dreamed of becoming a teacher, while Daniel had been popular and athletic, the star of the regional baseball team. They married young, the summer after graduation, in a ceremony at the old mission church that everyone in town attended. Their daughter, Sophia, was born a year later, followed by their son, Miguel, 2 years after that. Those who knew Rebecca described her as gentle and devoted, a woman who volunteered at the church food bank, who read stories to children at the library where she worked 3 days a week, who planted sunflowers in her small front yard each spring and tended them carefully through the brutal summer heat. Daniel was different, charming when he wanted to be, quick with a smile and a joke at the garage. He was also known for a temper that could flare without warning. More than one neighbor had heard raised voices coming from the Martinez home late at night, though no one spoke of it openly. This was a town where people minded their own business, where family matters stayed within 4 walls, where the code of silence was as much a part of the landscape as the desert itself. August 14, 1998, began like any other Friday in Esperanza. The sun rose over the Sandia Mountains to the west, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber before the heat descended like a weight. Rebecca woke early, as she always did, to prepare breakfast for Daniel before he left for work at 7. The children were still asleep in the small bedroom they shared down the narrow hallway. The kitchen window was open, letting in the morning air that still held a whisper of coolness before the day's furnace ignited. The scent of coffee filled the modest kitchen with its worn linoleum floor and pale yellow walls. Daniel ate quickly, said little, kissed Rebecca briefly before heading out the door to his truck. The screen door slammed behind him, a sound Rebecca had heard 1,000 times before. After the children woke, Rebecca gave them cereal and orange juice, then settled them in front of the television to watch cartoons while she cleaned the breakfast dishes. She wore a simple cotton dress, pale blue with small white flowers and sandals. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail. She made a shopping list on a scrap of paper: milk, bread, eggs, chicken for dinner. She told Sophia and Miguel she would be back soon, that they should stay inside where it was cool, that their grandmother would be checking on them. Daniel's mother, Luisa Martinez, lived just 2 streets over and often helped with the children when Rebecca ran errands. At approximately 9:30 in the morning, according to Luisa Martinez's later testimony, Rebecca called her to confirm she was heading to the store and that she would stop by to drop off a library book Luisa had requested. Luisa said Rebecca sounded normal, perhaps a little tired, but nothing unusual. This would be the last confirmed conversation anyone had with Rebecca Martinez. Daniel's statement, given to deputies that first night, was that Rebecca had left around 9:30 and he had expected her back by noon. When she did not return by 2 in the afternoon, he said he began to worry. He called his mother, who said she had not seen Rebecca, that Rebecca had never stopped by with the book as promised. Daniel said he drove to the grocery store but did not see their truck in the parking lot. He called the library, but Rebecca had not been scheduled to work that day. By 6 that evening, as the sun began its descent and shadows lengthened across the desert, Daniel went to the county sheriff's office to report his wife missing. The initial response was measured. Adults go missing for various reasons, and the first 24 hours are often a waiting game. But Deputy Carl Sandoval, who took Daniel's statement, noted in his report that the husband seemed oddly calm, almost rehearsed in his recounting of the day's events. Daniel sat in the hard plastic chair in the small office, his work boots leaving traces of red dust on the scuffed floor, his hands resting on his knees, steady and still. He answered questions in a monotone, rarely making eye contact. When asked if he and Rebecca had been arguing, Daniel shook his head. When asked if Rebecca had any reason to leave, any problems at home, he said no, everything was fine, she loved the children, she would never leave the children. But by the following morning, when Rebecca still had not returned and had not contacted anyone, the investigation shifted into higher gear. Search teams were organized. Volunteers gathered at the fire station at dawn. The high desert in August is unforgiving, a place where temperatures can soar above 100 degrees by midday, where rattlesnakes coil in the shade of rocks, where the landscape itself seems hostile to human presence. Search parties fanned out across the terrain surrounding Esperanza, walking grid patterns through scrubland, checking abandoned buildings, scanning the arroyos and washes where flash floods could sweep away evidence in minutes. Rebecca's truck was discovered on the morning of August 17th, 72 hours after she vanished. A state highway patrol officer spotted it pulled off to the side of Highway 60, about 30 miles south of Esperanza, near a place where the road cuts through a particularly desolate stretch of desert. The truck was unlocked. The keys were in the ignition, turned to the off position. Rebecca's brown leather purse sat on the passenger seat, her wallet inside containing $43 in cash and her driver's license. A plastic grocery bag on the floor held a gallon of milk and a loaf of bread, both spoiled in the heat. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, no broken glass. The truck simply sat there as if Rebecca had pulled over and walked away into the emptiness. Forensic technicians processed the vehicle methodically. They found Rebecca's fingerprints on the steering wheel and door handle, which was expected. They found Daniel's fingerprints as well, also expected since he drove the truck regularly. They found no other prints, no foreign fibers, no trace evidence that suggested anyone else had been in the vehicle. The odometer reading was noted, 73,214 miles. Investigators would later calculate that the distance from the Martinez home to the location where the truck was found was approximately 31 miles, accounting for roughly 62 miles round trip. But Rebecca had supposedly been going to the grocery store in town, less than 2 miles from her home. The area surrounding the abandoned truck was searched extensively. Bloodhounds were brought in and given Rebecca's scent from clothing taken from her home. The dogs tracked in circles near the truck but then lost the trail, as if Rebecca had simply evaporated. Helicopters flew overhead, their rotors beating against the silent sky, observers scanning the landscape for any sign of disturbance, any flash of pale blue fabric, any indication of where a young woman might have gone. They found nothing. In Esperanza, the community rallied with the fierce loyalty small towns are known for. Flyers with Rebecca's photograph were posted on every telephone pole, in every store window, at the post office, and the gas stations and the church. Her image looked out from these posters with dark eyes and a gentle smile, frozen in a moment before her disappearance. Prayer vigils were held at the mission church, candles flickering in the gathering darkness as voices rose in supplication and hope. Volunteers organized searches every weekend for months, walking the same ground over and over, refusing to accept that one of their own could simply vanish. But as the investigation progressed, certain details began to trouble the deputies working the case. Deputy Sandoval and Detective Maria Fuentes, who had been assigned as the lead investigator, began to notice inconsistencies in Daniel Martinez's timeline. He had said Rebecca left around 9:30. His mother confirmed the phone call at that time. But when questioned more closely, Daniel struggled to account for his own whereabouts that morning. He said he went to work at 7, as usual. His father and uncle confirmed he arrived on time, but shop records showed that Daniel had left the garage around 8:45, telling his father he needed to run an errand. He returned around 11:15. When pressed about where he had gone during those 2.5 hours, Daniel's answers became vague. He said he had driven around, needed to clear his head, had been thinking about things. What things, the detectives asked. Just things, Daniel replied. Those who knew him said Daniel's behavior in the days following Rebecca's disappearance seemed off, though they struggled to articulate exactly how. He appeared at search efforts but stood at the periphery, watching rather than actively participating. He spoke to reporters when they arrived from Albuquerque and Santa Fe, his face composed, his words measured, appealing for anyone with information to come forward. But there was something in his eyes, some absence of the desperate anguish one might expect from a man whose wife had vanished. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves, comparing notes, sharing observations that did not quite add up to evidence but felt significant nonetheless. Detective Fuentes requested phone records. The Martinez home phone showed Rebecca's call to Luisa at 9:28 that morning. There were no other outgoing calls that day. No calls to friends. No calls to the library. Nothing to suggest where Rebecca might have planned to go or who she might have planned to meet. Cell phones were not yet common in Esperanza in 1998, especially among families of modest means, so there were no cell records to examine. The grocery store where Rebecca supposedly was heading was canvassed thoroughly. Not a single employee remembered seeing her that day. The store's security camera, a grainy black and white system that recorded over itself every 72 hours, showed no footage of Rebecca. By the time investigators requested the tapes, the relevant time period had already been recorded over. This was not suspicious in itself, merely unfortunate, but it left another gap in the timeline that could not be filled. Friends of Rebecca came forward to speak with investigators. They described a woman who had seemed increasingly withdrawn in the months before her disappearance. Sarah Chen, who had known Rebecca since childhood and worked at the library with her, told Detective Fuentes that Rebecca had seemed worried about something but would not say what. Sarah remembered one conversation in particular, about 3 weeks before Rebecca vanished, when they were shelving books together in the quiet library. Rebecca had asked Sarah, seemingly out of nowhere, whether Sarah thought it was wrong to keep secrets to protect people you loved. Sarah had been puzzled by the question and asked what Rebecca meant. Rebecca had shaken her head, smiled sadly, and said, "Never mind, forget she asked." Another friend, Patricia Romero, reported that she had seen what appeared to be bruises on Rebecca's upper arms one day in July when they met for coffee. When Patricia asked about them, Rebecca had pulled her sleeves down and said she had bumped into a door frame, clumsy as always. But Patricia noticed that Rebecca would not meet her eyes when she said it, and the pattern of the marks did not look like they came from walking into anything. They looked like fingerprints, Patricia told Detective Fuentes, like someone had grabbed her hard. When confronted with these statements, Daniel denied ever harming his wife. He admitted they argued sometimes, like any couple, but he said he had never laid a hand on her. His parents supported him, saying Daniel was a good husband, a good father, that people in town were quick to gossip and slow to understand that Rebecca had always been fragile, delicate, maybe not suited for the harsh realities of life in a small desert town. Perhaps she had simply chosen to leave, they suggested. Perhaps the pressure of motherhood and marriage had become too much. Perhaps she was out there somewhere, alive and well, just needing space. But this theory did not explain why Rebecca would abandon her children, whom everyone agreed she adored. It did not explain why she would leave her purse, her money, her identification. It did not explain the spoiled groceries in the truck, suggesting she had been interrupted while shopping or shortly after. And it did not explain the growing pile of small details that seemed to point in one direction, toward one person, even as the hard evidence remained frustratingly absent. Investigators searched the Martinez home with Daniel's consent. They found nothing obviously incriminating. Rebecca's clothes hung in the closet. Her toiletries were in the bathroom. Photographs of the family smiled from frames on the walls. The children's rooms were neat and orderly. In the garage, Daniel's tools were arranged on pegboards, organized with the precision of someone who valued control and order. The family vehicles were examined. Daniel's personal truck, a red Chevy that he drove to work, was processed for evidence. They found nothing unusual. The weeks turned to months. The initial frenzy of media attention faded. The search parties grew smaller, then stopped altogether. The case remained officially open, but the leads dried up. Detective Fuentes continued to investigate, working other cases during the day but returning to Rebecca's file in quiet moments, reading through statements, studying photographs, looking for the detail she knew she must be missing. She visited the site where the truck was found dozens of times, standing in the heat and the silence, trying to imagine what had happened there. By the end of 1998, Rebecca Martinez's disappearance had settled into the category of cold case, another unsolved mystery in a state that had seen its share of vanishings over the years. The file was thick with reports and interviews and photographs, but it led nowhere conclusive. Daniel continued working at the auto garage. The children, now 6 and 4, asked less frequently when their mother would come home. Luisa Martinez cared for them during the day while Daniel worked. Life as it does continued. Clears throat. For those who have ever lived in a small town, you understand how silence can be its own kind of presence, how the things people do not say can echo louder than words. In the 2 years following Rebecca's disappearance, Esperanza existed in that silence. People nodded to Daniel when they saw him at the hardware store or the gas station, but the conversations were brief, the eye contact fleeting. Some believed he was a grieving husband, unfairly suspected by authorities who needed someone to blame. Others believed something darker, something they could not prove but felt in their bones. By the spring of 2000, Daniel had begun dadding again. This caused a fresh wave of gossip and judgment. Some said it was too soon, disrespectful to Rebecca's memory, evidence of guilt. Others said a man needed companionship, needed help raising two young children, that life moved forward whether we wanted it to or not. The woman he began seeing was named Jennifer Ortiz, a secretary at the county courthouse who had moved to Esperanza a year earlier from Las Cruces. She was kind to Sophia and Miguel, patient with their moods and their nightmares, and Daniel's family welcomed her, grateful that someone was willing to bring normalcy back to the household. But Sophia, now 8 years old, had begun showing signs of distress. She struggled in school, had difficulty concentrating, and was prone to sudden crying spells that her teachers could not explain. She drew pictures in art class that concerned the school counselor: dark houses with no windows, figures with mouths but no eyes, empty rooms with shadows in the corners. When the counselor gently asked Sophia about the drawings, the girl would simply shrug and say she did not know why she drew such things. Miguel, younger and with fewer clear memories of his mother, seemed to adjust more easily, though he clung to Jennifer with an intensity that suggested deep insecurity. At night, both children suffered from nightmares. Louisa, who still watched them frequently, told friends that Sophia sometimes woke screaming about the desert, about being lost, about someone calling for help that never came. Daniel and Jennifer married in a quiet ceremony at the courthouse in November 2001. There was no celebration, no reception, just a signing of papers and a brief exchange of vows. They continued living in the house on Cal de los Sueños, the same house Rebecca had called home, and this too prompted whispers. How could he stay there, people asked. How could he sleep in that bed, walk those rooms, without being haunted by what might have happened? Detective Fuentes had been promoted to sergeant by then, but still carried Rebecca's case with her like a stone in her pocket. She checked in periodically, looking for new developments, running searches for unidentified remains, following tips that inevitably led nowhere. The truck had been released from evidence and Daniel had sold it. The few personal belongings of Rebecca's that had been collected were returned to the family. The trail had gone so completely cold it was as if Rebecca Martinez had never existed at all, except as a name on a missing persons list and a photograph yellowing in a forgotten file. But in the summer of 2002, 4 years after her mother's disappearance, Sophia began telling stories at school that caught the attention of her 4th-grade teacher, Mrs. Catherine Benson. During a writing assignment about a memorable day, Sophia wrote about riding in a truck with her father, about going somewhere far away, about seeing her mother lying very still in the desert. The writing was disjointed and unclear, the prose of a 9-year-old struggling with concepts too large and dark for her young mind to process. Mrs. Benson showed the assignment to the school principal, who contacted social services, who in turn contacted Sergeant Fuentes. The interview with Sophia was conducted carefully, with a child psychologist present, in a room designed to be non-threatening and comfortable. Sophia sat on a soft couch, holding a stuffed rabbit, speaking in a voice so quiet the recording equipment barely captured her words. She said she remembered being in the blue truck, the one her mother drove. She said it was hot and she was thirsty. She said her father was there and her mother, and they were driving on a road she did not recognize. She said her mother was crying. She said they stopped, and her father told her to stay in the truck and he took her mother outside. She said when he came back, her mother did not. When asked when this happened, Sophia could not provide a clear answer. She thought it was a long time ago, when she was little. She said she did not remember going there, but she remembered being there, if that made sense. The psychologist noted that the child showed signs of possible traumatic memory, fragmented and unreliable, possibly constructed from fears and nightmares rather than actual events. But there was enough specificity in some details to warrant further investigation. Daniel was brought in for another interview. This time, he arrived with a lawyer, a development that signaled the seriousness with which he was taking the renewed interest in his wife's case. He sat across from Sergeant Fuentes in the same room where he had sat nearly 4 years earlier, but now his composure was replaced with visible anger. He called the questioning harassment. He said his daughter was a troubled child, confused and traumatized by losing her mother, that she had nightmares and could not distinguish them from reality. He said he had cooperated fully with the investigation from the beginning, had provided alibis, had allowed searches, had done everything asked of him. He said it was unconscionable that authorities would use a child's fantasies to persecute him. His lawyer pointed out correctly that a child's unclear memories from years past, unsubstantiated by any physical evidence, would never be admissible in court. Without a body, without forensic evidence, without witnesses, there was no case to pursue. The interview ended with no charges filed and a growing sense among investigators that the truth might remain forever buried in the desert silence. The marriage between Daniel and Jennifer began to deteriorate around this same time. Neighbors reported hearing arguments, seeing Jennifer leaving the house with the children, staying with friends for days at a time before returning. Those who knew Jennifer said she had become withdrawn, nervous, that she jumped at sudden noises and seemed constantly on edge. She had lost weight, stopped attending church, and spent hours cleaning the house obsessively, scrubbing floors that were already clean, washing walls, as if trying to erase something invisible but persistent. In March 2003, Jennifer filed for separation. She took Sophia and Miguel and moved to an apartment in the next town over, 15 miles from Esperanza. The divorce proceedings were quiet and relatively amicable, at least on the surface. Jennifer asked for custody of the children, and Daniel did not contest it, agreeing to visitation rights and child support. The house on Cal de los Sueños stood empty for several months before Daniel sold it, and moved into a small rental closer to his work. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, you understand the particular torture of that position, the way suspicion eats at you from the inside, how you search for evidence in every word and gesture, how you lie awake wondering if the person sleeping beside you is capable of the unthinkable. Jennifer never spoke publicly about why she left Daniel, but friends said privately that she had found something, or learned something, or simply could no longer bear the weight of not knowing. The years passed with a kind of terrible monotony. Sophia graduated from high school in 2010, left New Mexico entirely, moved to Colorado where no one knew her story. Miguel followed a similar path, joining the military after high school and being stationed in North Carolina. Jennifer remarried and tried to build a life that was not defined by the shadow of Rebecca Martinez. Daniel continued working, growing older, grayer, moving through the rhythms of life in Esperanza as if nothing had ever happened. Detective Fuentes retired in 2015, but before she did, she spent weeks organizing Rebecca's case file, ensuring that everything was documented and accessible, writing a detailed summary of her investigation and her suspicions. She included notes about the timeline inconsistencies, the marks on Rebecca's arms, Sophia's troubled memories, the abandoned truck with its spoiled groceries. She wrote that while she could not prove Daniel Martinez had killed his wife, she believed he had, and she hoped that one day someone would find the evidence to bring him to justice. The file sat in the cold case division, reviewed periodically when someone had time, but never yielding new leads. The desert had kept its secrets. Rebecca remained among the vanished, a name on a memorial wall, a daughter and sister and mother who had simply ceased to exist one August morning. Clears throat. But in January 2024, 26 years after Rebecca disappeared, something shifted. Miguel Martinez, now 30 years old, married with 2 children of his own, contacted the San Miguel County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with someone about his mother's case. He was connected with Detective Raymond Torres, who had inherited the cold case files when he joined the department 3 years earlier. Miguel said he needed to tell someone what he knew, what he had remembered, what he could no longer carry alone. The meeting took place on January 15, 2024, in an interview room that smelled of old coffee and floor cleaner. Miguel sat with his hands clasped on the table, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and direct gaze. He told Detective Torres that he had been in therapy for the past 5 years, working through trauma and memories that had been buried for most of his life. He said the therapist had helped him understand that some of his nightmares were not nightmares at all, but fragmented memories of actual events. He said he remembered the day his mother disappeared differently than he had been told it happened. He said he remembered being in the truck, the blue Ford, with his mother and father and sister. He remembered it was hot, unbearably hot, and he was thirsty, but his mother said they would get water soon. He remembered his father driving, not his mother, and his mother was in the passenger seat, very quiet, her eyes red like she had been crying. He remembered driving for a long time, the landscape unchanging, just desert and sky and the ribbon of road. He remembered his father pulling off the highway onto a dirt road that led into emptiness. He remembered stopping. He remembered his father telling him and Sophia to stay in the truck, that he and their mother needed to talk outside, that it would just be a minute. Miguel said he remembered watching through the dusty window as his father and mother walked away from the truck, maybe 20 yards, maybe more, his memory unclear on the distance. He remembered seeing them standing there, his mother's blue dress bright against the dull earth. He remembered his father's hands moving, animated, like he was explaining something or arguing. He remembered his mother shaking her head. Then he remembered something happening very quickly, too quickly for his 4-year-old mind to process. A movement, his mother falling, his father standing over her. He remembered his father bending down, then standing up, then walking back to the truck alone. He said when his father got back in the truck, he did not look at the children. He started the engine and they drove away, leaving his mother there in the desert. Miguel said he remembered crying, asking where his mother was, asking why they were leaving her. He said his father told him to be quiet, that his mother was fine, that she would come home later, that he needed to stop crying and forget what he had seen. He said he remembered the truck stopping again, later on the side of the highway, and his father wiping down the steering wheel and door handles with a cloth, then telling Sophia and Miguel that they had not been in this truck today, that they had been at home, that if anyone asked they needed to say they were at home. Miguel said he was 4 years old and he was terrified and he did what his father told him. He buried the memory so deep it became like a dream, insubstantial and uncertain. But over years of therapy, piece by piece, the memory had reconstructed itself with a clarity that felt undeniable. Detective Torres listened to this account with the careful attention of someone who had spent years learning when people were telling the truth. He asked questions, probing gently for details. Miguel described the dirt road as being on the left side of the highway, heading south, maybe 30 miles outside of town, near a place where there was a strange rock formation that looked like a broken tooth. He said there were no trees, no buildings, just open desert. He said his mother's dress was pale blue with white flowers. Torres pulled up satellite maps and asked Miguel to identify possible locations. After studying the images for an hour, Miguel indicated an area approximately 32 miles south of Esperanza, where a dirt track branched off Highway 60 into BLM land. The rock formation he remembered was visible in aerial photographs. Tours immediately organized a search operation. On January 20th, 2024, a team of investigators, forensic anthropologists, and search and rescue personnel gathered at the location Miguel had identified. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in to scan the area. Cadaver dogs were deployed. The search was methodical and slow, conducted in a grid pattern, every square meter examined carefully. It took 3 days. On January 23rd, approximately 200 yards from where the dirt road left the highway, in a shallow depression beneath a creosote bush, searchers found skeletal remains partially buried in the sandy soil. A tattered piece of blue fabric clung to the bones. Near the remains, they found a simple gold wedding band, tarnished but intact. Dental records would later confirm what everyone already knew. They had found Rebecca Martinez. The autopsy report, prepared by the state medical examiner, indicated that Rebecca had died from blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. The hyoid bone in her throat was fractured, suggesting possible strangulation as well. The forensic anthropologist noted that the body had been lying face down, partially covered with dirt and rocks in what appeared to be a hasty attempt at burial. Time and desert scavengers had scattered some of the remains, but enough was recovered to tell the story of violence and death. On February 2, 2024, 26 years and 6 months after Rebecca Martinez disappeared, Daniel Martinez was arrested at his home in Esperanza. He was 65 years old, retired from the auto garage, living alone. When deputies arrived with the warrant, neighbors reported that he showed no resistance, no surprise, just a kind of weary resignation. He was read his rights, handcuffed, and led to a waiting patrol car while a small crowd gathered on the street to watch. The arrest made headlines across New Mexico and beyond. News vans descended on Esperanza once again, reporters interviewing anyone willing to talk about the case that had haunted the small town for more than a quarter century. Some residents expressed shock, saying they had known Daniel his whole life and could not believe he was capable of such violence. Others said they had always known, had always felt it, that justice had simply taken too long to arrive. At his arraignment, Daniel Martinez pleaded not guilty. His new attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best, that a child's recovered memories from decades past were notoriously unreliable, that there was no forensic evidence linking Daniel to the crime scene, no murder weapon, no witnesses other than his traumatized son, whose testimony might not even be admissible. The judge ordered Daniel held without bail, citing the severity of the charges and the decades of flight risk he represented, even though he had never fled. The trial began in September 2024 and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution built their case methodically, presenting the timeline of Rebecca's disappearance, the inconsistencies in Daniel's statements from 1998, the witnesses who testified about Rebecca's bruises and withdrawn behavior in the months before she died. They presented evidence of Daniel's 2.5-hour absence from work the morning Rebecca disappeared, time unaccounted for that matched perfectly with the drive to the location where her body was found. They presented Miguel's testimony, now corroborated by the discovery of remains exactly where his memory had placed them. Miguel took the stand on the 7th day of the trial. He wore his military dress uniform and spoke in a steady voice that occasionally broke with emotion. He recounted his memories, acknowledged their fragmented nature, but insisted on their essential truth. He said he had lived with the weight of that day for his entire life, had tried to bury it, had tried to pretend it had not happened, But that therapy had helped him understand that healing required truth, even when truth was painful. Sophia also testified, now 34, a social worker in Denver with her own family. She said her memories were less clear than her brother's, more like impressions and feelings than specific images. But she remembered being in the truck. She remembered the heat and her mother crying. She remembered her father's anger, thick and dangerous in the confined space. She remembered arriving home without her mother and being told never to speak of that day. She said she had obeyed, had buried it, had tried to be a good daughter to a father she feared and could not prove was a killer. The defense called character witnesses who testified to Daniel's peaceful nature, his dedication to his family, his decades of service to the community. They presented alternative theories. Perhaps Rebecca had been killed by someone else. Perhaps the children's memories were false constructions influenced by suggestion and therapy. They argued that the state had built a case on the testimony of traumatized children and the discovery of remains in a vast desert where bodies could be dumped by anyone. But the jury, after deliberating for 2 days, returned a verdict of guilty on all charges, first-degree murder and tampering with evidence. When the verdict was read, Daniel Martinez showed no emotion, sitting motionless in his chair while his attorney placed a hand on his shoulder. In the gallery, Miguel and Sophia held hands and wept quietly. Several people who had known Rebecca attended the trial every day, bearing witness, waiting for this moment of accountability. At sentencing in November 2024, the judge noted the exceptional cruelty of Daniel's actions. Not just the killing itself, but the decades of allowing Rebecca's family to suffer without answers, the psychological abuse of forcing his children to bury their memories and live with a killer, the casual way he had moved on with his life, while Rebecca lay forgotten in the desert. The judge sentenced Daniel Martinez to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Rebecca Martinez's remains were finally laid to rest in December 2024 at the Mission Church in Esperanza, where she had been married more than 3 decades earlier. The service was attended by hundreds, a community finally able to mourn properly, to say goodbye to a daughter lost too soon. Her children placed sunflowers on her grave, remembering how she had loved those bright blooms, how she had tended them so carefully in the hard desert soil. The case of Rebecca Martinez stands as a testament to the persistence of truth, even when buried beneath years of silence and fear. It reminds us that victims deserve justice, no matter how much time has passed, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important testimony. Miguel Martinez, in a statement after the trial, said that coming forward had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but that his mother deserved to be remembered, to be found, to finally rest in peace. For those who followed this case, it represents both the failure of a system that could not protect Rebecca while she lived, and the ultimate success of that same system in finally holding her killer accountable. It demonstrates the importance of never closing cold cases, of keeping files accessible, of believing victims and listening to survivors, even when their memories are fractured and painful. It shows us that the desert, for all its silence, cannot keep every secret forever, and that justice, delayed though it may be, can still arrive. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share this episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard, carrying memories they have been told to forget, living in the shadow of violence that has never been acknowledged. Every cold case represents a person who mattered, a family still waiting, a truth that deserves to surface. Rebecca Martinez waited 26 years. Others are waiting still.